Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the SSB Ground School Series. We're getting near the end. We've got three more. Tonight, we're going to hear from Clemens Ceipek. He's going to talk about accident statistics and how not to be part of this, and more importantly, how not to be part of the statistics. But before we get started here, I want to recognize John Seaborn, our 18-meter champion. He's joining us as he often does, and we're very delighted, of course, to have John in our club for a whole lot of reasons. And so welcome, John. I also like to recognize Sayu Gomez-Falk, my primary student who soloed this week. So be sure and give him the thumbs up when you see him at the field. And you might want to stay out of his way, too, when he's flying. So we're still working on getting these landings just the way that we want them. But he's doing great. And he'll be a great member of the club. He's also a special board member representing the youth and trying to get more youth into our organization. Also Gary Stubbe's not on, but I want to recognize him for having fixed the brakes on our DG. From what I understand was no mean task. That was a bear of a job. Gary's working on his A&P rating, and I suspect he'll do very, very well as that. Joe Brack's also with us. Joe is working on getting a ground station set up in our shack. There's still more work to do on that, of course, but it's moving along. And with those comments out of the way, without a much further ado, I'd like to introduce Clemens. Clemens is our president, our club president. He's been doing a fantastic job, not just with running up OLC points, but he's made some charts that are just fantastic, and we'll be going in all the club gliders and probably most of the private ships. It has the database of where to land out. It's beautiful the way it shows where the best landing points are if you're getting low, places to go, what landmarks to see along the way, and of course there's a lot of them in Colorado. So Clemens has done a lot of research on the accidents and the statistics, and he's a very analytical guy, but also very good at taking that analytics and putting it together into an understandable format. So anyway, glad you all have joined, and Clemens, would you like to take it away?
Sure, thank you, Armand. Tonight we have a more sobering topic compared to the last session. So I promise, I won't promise that it will be uplifting, but it will be. I would be remiss to not talk about this because if this can help anyone avoid an incident or even an accident, it will be time worth spending. So thank you all for joining, and I'll go and look for the presentation. So share screen, let me see, there it is, and I have to do this, perfect, and presentation mode. Okay, so this is a picture that made me do this exercise. So a year and a half ago, a bunch of us were flying out in Nephi, Utah, and on July 1, John Weber and Tom Bjork, who were in this Arcus M, had this terrible accident just northeast of Ephraim, Utah, not far away from Nephi. You can see down the plane, and the airport of Ephraim, which is a perfectly good public airport, is about 7 miles away. So this is not unlike if somebody would crash on Lee Hill. There's a perfectly good airport in landing distance. and there was this terrible accident. And so it really depressed me for a little bit, and it prompted me for in the winter that came after that to take a look at more than 250 soaring accidents and detailed accident reports. And the majority of those accident reports actually from Europe. There's about 100 from the US, but the majority were from Europe. And the reason that I looked at the European accident reports is because they are a lot more detailed. It's not like the NTSB, which tends to be a little cursory in their reports. And very often you find in an NTSB report as the reason of an accident, you find loss of lift as the reason. And I think loss of lift is a ridiculous reason for an accident. It obviously is not why there was an accident. We all experience loss of lift on a flight. So I wanted to know why accidents really those accident reports, and I tried to analyze them and synthesize them and really try and distill why accidents happen. And so that's what we will cover today. And more importantly, as Armand said, how can we avoid this? So let me see how I get to the next page here. There we
Clemens,
go.
you're
all right. Can you hear me?
Well, sometimes you're breaking up, and I don't know if it's your internet connection or mine.
It said for a moment, it said unstable internet connection. It's gone. So can you hear me now?
Yeah. If it gets worse, I may ask you to stop your video. Well, if it makes, hopefully it wouldn't take away the screen sharing, but if you do have an internet connection problem, maybe we'll need to ask you to be on video.
Sure. I don't know what's happening. We have pretty fast internet, but it doesn't always work 100%. So please interrupt me if it stops. Yeah. Does it work now?
Yeah, you're coming through fine now.
Okay. All right. So let's start with this slide here. So we all, when we get in a car, we all feel like there's some risk involved when we get in the car. And actually, when I first got my license to fly gliders in Europe, my instructor told me, well, the most dangerous part of gliding is the drive to the airport, which I never believed. But what do you guys think? If you think of spending 1 hour in a car versus 1 hour in a glider, how do you rate the risk of gliding versus the rate of driving? I'll spare you the guessing. It's basically more than 40 times the risk that you will have a fatal accident in a glider in 1 hour on a per activity hour basis. So if you spend 1,000 hours driving, 1,000 hours in a glider, it's more than 40 times as dangerous to fly, not specifically to mountain soaring sites, and mountain soaring sites tend to be more dangerous than flatland sites. So I would add that too. So this is probably an optimistic view of our sport, and that's a sad statistic. But I would be remiss if I would not share it. But it does feel a lot less dangerous. And so why does it feel less dangerous? And I think it happens. There's three core reasons that make it feel less dangerous. The first is that gliding is kind of a binary thing. The glider flies until it doesn't. So if you scratch over the trees and you don't hit anything, you land. If you fly a final turn to the airport just half a knot above stall speed, nothing happens. And so you're not aware of that risk. And that is actually the second one. It's soaring is obscure. The risk is obscure. We may not even know that something almost happened, right? So if, as I said, if you do the final turn just half a knot above stall speed, you're not aware that you almost stalled and spun in on the turn to final. And that makes it feel it's less dangerous. It also makes it feel it's less dangerous because when nothing happened, we tend to think nothing will happen. So it's also be deceiving. And the more often nothing happened, we do things and we keep doing the same things and nothing happened. And the more often we do the same things over and over again and nothing happened, the more we think nothing will happen. And there's a lot of documented psychological studies about this phenomenon. It's a real fallacy that our brain keeps tuning out when nothing happened. We condition our brain that nothing will happen. And then this is also interesting if you think about it, that most things we do in life have gotten a lot safer over the years. So if you look at these are statistics from put together by Steven Pinker, a fantastic book, by the way. I can highly recommend this book. It's called Enlightenment Now. But it looks at our life, and our life gets better all the time. We live in a better time than ever before. And you can see that driving, air travel, or work, all those things have gotten a lot safer over the years, versus you look at soaring, and that's not true. So this is for Germany, which publishes this data, if there's statistics like this for North America, and they basically look the same. The SSA keeps saying, the trends in the US, the published trends is the number of fatalities does tend to go down a little bit year by year, but it's obscured by the fact that also fewer people are flying. So on a per person basis or on a per activity hour basis, soaring is not getting safer. It is about staying the same, versus most other things have gotten safer. And then this is also interesting, that experience is not a cure. So if you look at the experience that the pilot had at the time of accident, you look at these accidents, you see that there doesn't seem to be much of a correlation between experience and accidents. And it might actually work against you. We'll get into that in a little bit. So why should we study accidents? I think there's two core reasons. One is that we might not get a chance to learn by ourselves. So 11% of accidents or serious incidents are actually fatal. So if we, and that's pretty high. Right, so we might not have a chance to learn from our own mistakes. We have to learn from the mistakes that others have made before us. And that's why I think it's so important that we look at what mistakes have others made. And then the good news is that most of the mistakes, and this really becomes apparent as you read them, most of the mistakes have been invented. So it's very hard to invent a new mistake that will end with a serious accident. The mistakes repeat over and over again. And that's why I think we can really learn from studying them. And then the question is, so how do we study them? And then the first thing I did is I looked at, the way of how accidents have been classified. And those classifications, they're all quite interesting, but they really don't tell you why things happen. So this is, for example, in the European Union publishes an annual safety report for gliding specifically. They have a huge safety report and they have a big section on gliding, and they will classify accidents by the type of operation. So they look at pleasure flights, contest flights, training flights. They look at phase of flight from landing, takeoff, and en route, and by safety risk. But it doesn't really tell you why the accident really happened. And there wasn't really anything that I found that really got into a lot of detail why accidents happen, and to get to the root causes. And that's what I try to do with my analysis. So I looked at these data points, and then I said, okay, so how can we find out what are the true root causes of accidents. And so we can, only if we know what the root causes are, can we do something about and prevent them. So my methodology was basically just a detailed review and interpretation of accident reports. And I will say there is an interpretation element involved because in all these accident reports, the accident reports typically do not spell out very clearly, you know, the pilot did this and this wrong. They try to stick to the facts. So, and because they just stick to the facts, you have to kind of interpret them a little bit. And so there's a bit of a judgment call on my part as I read them in terms of what is it that I think the pilot actually did wrong, and that's what I used to classify them. So I was looking for, did the pilot make a mistake that ultimately led to the accident, and what was the mistake? And sometimes it's a chain of mistakes, and we all know this, that typically accidents are always a chain reaction. There's one thing that could have, in many cases, there's one thing that could have broken the chain and prevented the accident. But even in those cases, in almost all those cases, there is something that you can pinpoint to and say, well, if I'm honest, that is something the pilot should have done differently. I could have done differently, and I was trying to get to what is it, where is that really that point where the mistake was made that. So I was looking for what is it that the pilot could have done differently to prevent that accident. And so this is the results on an overall basis, and I will go into a lot of detail behind that, but I want to give you the results up front, the way how I classified them. And you can see the biggest root cause is what I call the failure to resist temptations, where the pilot simply, was shown a poisoned apple, didn't know the apple was poisoned and bit into it anyway because it looked so good. And that's the temptation and failure to resist temptations. And you will see what those temptations were and why pilots couldn't resist. We will get into that. That's the biggest root cause of accidents. Basic piloting mistakes. So these are things where you say, well, that really shouldn't happen. This is just basic flying mistakes, airmanship things, basic airmanship things. Make up a good amount of accidents, and they're actually really easy to avoid. But if we're diligent and careful and really think about it, we'll get into that. 12% of accidents happened before the flight even began. They happened with pre-flight negligence. 6% were about situational awareness things. People did not see. Many medias fall into this category, but not only medias. There's other things we have to pay attention to. And then there's about 12% where I really couldn't figure it out. And say the majority of those are really unavoidable, and we will get accidents happen that are really unavoidable from the pilot's standpoint. In some cases, it was just not clear to me, and so I left them out. But the good news is 90% are avoidable. So 90% are avoidable. If we can avoid those 90%, it's already a huge step in the right direction. So let's look at failure to resist temptations. And I want to show you a little video. This is Stefan Langer who published this. He's one of the top competition pilots in Europe, junior, I think it was junior world's #3 or something like that. He's an excellent pilot. He publishes a lot on YouTube. You might follow him. But I want to show you this little video because I think it illustrates the point that I'm trying to make here.
Okay. Nope.
So I'm going to stop it here. I mean, you can. This was during a competition in the Czech Republic, and I mean, there's great fields down there, so plenty of space to land, and yet somehow this still was a very scary situation, and he called it a scary outlanding. There was no reason to have a scary outlanding here. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but he didn't even open the spoilers during this landing. So the gear came out literally 1 second before he touched down. But he's basically looking for lift until he can't keep looking for lift any longer. So until he touches the ground, he's looking for lift. And so he's just tempted and tempted and tempted to try and find lift. And if he had been just a little bit slower on those last turns, or if there had been a little bit of a downdraft, he might have been in the trees. So nothing happened on this one. As you know, as we said, he might have walked away and said, well, you know, maybe nothing happened, so nothing will happen, and he will keep doing the same thing over again. I don't know. But I think it's really important to realize that this is not safe. And he was circling above perfectly landable fields, but maybe at 150 feet above the ground. So clearly not a safe thing. And we'll get to it in a moment why that is, why, oops, I want to show this again. So next page. There we go. So here are some examples that fall into this category of failure to resist temptations. And you will see a pattern here. So here you've got an airline who crashed after he was looking for lift up to 300 feet above the ground next to the airfield. So he kept circling and circling next to the airfield. Then he finally extended the gear. At the point he extended the gear, he was so slow that the glider stalled when he put the gear out. He stalled and spun in, and I don't think he survived that one. A pilot with 1,800 hours of experience failed to make a timely land-out decision, circled at a very low altitude, wasn't specifically spelled out how low, stalled and spun in. And it is kind of keeps going. So in some cases, it's also other things. So it's not just stalling and spinning in from a low altitude, but a pilot with 2,500 hours of experience continued a flight over unlandable terrain, and then cartwheeled into the ground. Another pilot with more than 2,000 hours of experience tried to start the engine above a land-out field, but it was so low by the time he tried to start the engine that he didn't really know what to do when the engine didn't start. He couldn't fly a pattern anymore and crashed into trees short of the field. Another one with almost 4,000 hours of experience circled in weak lift along a slope, stalled and spun in. So we learned that be stalling and spinning, right? This is kind of what comes out. If you look at accident reports, it will say the reason of these accidents were stalling and spinning in. Well, I bet none of the pilots that came to harm here didn't know that they should fly at a safe speed. All of those pilots had plenty of experience. They all knew about stalling and spinning in. They all knew how to fly coordinated turns, but they didn't resist a temptation. They let themselves fly so low and at such a low altitude in slow turns that it just wasn't possible at that point to fly coordinated and have a safe speed because they were already so low. So they got into the situation by way earlier. And so just to say it's safe to fly safe speed and fly coordinated that's true. But if you maneuver yourself into a situation where you can no longer do this, then that's a problem. Or this is in a lot of cases, accidents near an airfield, the final turn panel. If the pilot arrives at the airfield so low that the pattern is so low, and then they fly the final turn to the field and they fly too slow and uncoordinated, the issue is not that they fly too slow and uncoordinated. The issue is that they are too low to begin with, because they're so low they can no longer fly coordinated and fast enough, because it's just not possible. Their wing would hit the ground on the turn to final. So it's this failure to resist temptations is a huge issue. And it happens over and over again. So what are the top mistakes? So if you look at these accidents, in you see the numbers in parentheses show how often those accidents happen. So a delayed landing to the airport caused the majority of these accidents. It's quite remarkable that people crash right next to the airfield. They circle, in most of those cases, it's circling down to a very low altitude, still looking for lift until it's too late. The same thing happens next to land out fields, not quite as often, probably only not quite as often because it doesn't happen that often. A lot of people do not fly cross country, so this will only happen to cross country pilots. Otherwise, it probably would happen even more often. Relying on an engine is third. So people who have an engine and think the engine will start, well, the engine may not start. And if you extend the engine at a low altitude and you can no longer fly a safe pattern, you've basically already created the chain of events that led to the accident. Flying too close to mountains falls into this category, and this is something we have to be very mindful of here. Flying in the mountains, often, it's most of the time nothing happens. The air is smooth, but there's one time the air isn't that smooth, or people stall and spin in and crash into the mountains. And there's the accident that I showed at the very beginning from John Weber in Nephi. There's no report published yet. I just checked before from the NTSB that has not been written up yet. But it looked to me like one of those accidents. So it's not in the statistic. I didn't classify it because there's no accident report, but it smells like it. Like one of those accidents, flying too close to terrain, flying too slow, trying to look for lift very close to the rocks, and stalling and spinning in. Out of glide range can happen, where people fly out of glide range without having a landable field and not having a landable field in glide, and they end up in the trees. Final glide judgment, flying into clouds. But the thing that really sticks out is these these delayed landing decisions. Making the decision to land too late, trying to look for lift too low is, in the majority of these cases, was the root cause. And so when do those, and you could see it in the video from Stefan Lange, it's clearly one of those cases. If that ended in an accident, I would have classified it along these lines here as a delayed land out decision very clearly. So when do we make these accidents? I think it's clear that they're made when the temptation is high. And we're not always in the same situation. So when contest scores are on the line, the temptation tends to be high. It can also happen when we badly want to avoid a land out. So there's situations where, for example, there was one accident somewhere where a club policy was to not land out. People were just not allowed to land out as a club policy. And so a pilot was desperately trying to avoid a land out, and it ended with the pilot losing his life because he was trying to comply with club policy not to land out. It's the most stupid club policy you can create, because it creates the situation where where people will put themselves at risk. And psychologically, there's Daniel Sazin wrote a really good article on this, that our mindset, our psychological mindset, and he's a behavioral psychologist. So our mindset, our psychology is such that when we are faced with a negative outcome, with something that we really dread, like if we dread a land out, we're much more likely to gamble. People take much higher risk in the face of likely loss than they will take in the face of likely gain. So whenever you feel, make yourself aware of this, that when you feel like you really do not want a certain outcome, that is when you're most likely to gamble with your life. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind. It can also happen, of course, when there's a goal we desperately want to achieve. So if somebody is on this mission to get this 1,000 kilometer flight in, and they just want to scratch over that last mountain pass, and that last mountain pass is a little bit too low, and they end up in the trees, that could also be one of those situations. When the perception of risk is low, that is another factor that comes into play. There's a great article from Martin Hellman that I highly recommend. He calls it the 99% safe maneuver. If you do, and I mentioned this before, if you do something 99 times and nothing happened, you think nothing will happen. Well, each time is still as dangerous as the first 99 times, and eventually something that is safe 99 out of 100 times will kill you at some point. It may not be the 100th time, it might be the third time, but it could be the 300th time, but it eventually will get you. And then when the risk tends to find us, there's very few soaring pilots that I've come across that are truly risk seekers. I mean, there are some people that get a kick out of risky situations, but I think they're very small minority. I think they're not, the sport is definitely not for them because they live on borrowed time. But the majority falls not into this category. The majority of people are not risk seekers. We all try to be conservative, but the risk will eventually find us. So if we delay a decision to do something, the risk comes at us, and suddenly we can't. We see the danger, and then it's too late to do something about it. So we can step into our own trap by waiting too long. So it's really the proactive decision making, especially with respect to landing. Landouts is a great example here. If we wait too long, the risk comes at us, and at some point we can't do anything about it anymore. So we have to proactively decide to do something that we're not going to be in danger. So how do we avoid them? Yeah, so one way to do this, John Cochran wrote another great article. I also highly recommend that. He wrote it, "You Will Be Tempted." It's very important that we keep in mind our priorities. And so we always say safety is our first priority, but that is often just a platitude. When we fly and we have this goal that we want to achieve, we might get carried away by the goal that we have in mind. And so especially when we get low to the ground, or if the weather deteriorates, it's very important that we reflect back and say, what really is the priority right now? And at some point, the priority is to be safe, not to find the next lift, or not to make it to the next airport. The priority is to be safe. And so if our priority is to be safe, then we have to act based on that priority. So reviewing our priorities in flight is very important. Pre-planning difficult decisions, that's very related to this. If we can, we're more likely to think of our priorities if we have thought of difficult situations, difficult decisions we might be facing. So if we're flying into an area where there is where the weather is deteriorating, it's important to have thought through where are the land out options and under what circumstances and at what altitude, and this goes to the margin question, where is my safety margin that I will not compromise on? And so if we pre-plan those situations, when we think about it, we might get into the situations where land out may be necessary. Well, then we're more likely to act on the land out and not wait so long until it's too late. Clearly never rely on an engine. Keep a safe distance to terrain. I mean, these are classic things, but we all know. But I think this resisting the temptation is really the key point. Obviously, always keep a fielding glide. All right. So these were I think if we can cover if we can stay away from these temptations, if we manage our temptations, I think we will cover a lot of potential issues. So the next different category, so we'll get into basic piloting mistakes. So this is an ugly video. I don't know, probably a lot of you will have seen it. It's 10 years ago. The lessons we can learn.
Now accidents have to be very careful now, not to twang. In fact, he pulled off. I bet that may well have been deliberate. So let's watch the glider as he makes his way down now to land. Shame the cloud base is so low. We may well see them later today. Going downwind at the moment, so the glider now turning towards final. Please don't do that.
Yeah, so dreadful. Clearly not an inexperienced pilot. I can't imagine an inexperienced pilot would fly a aerobatic glider at an air show and still makes a very basic piloting mistake. If you watch the video, you will see that the spoilers were open, for example. He probably, I don't know why he released it at altitude. That may have been some issue, it doesn't really matter. But he may have thought he would land downwind first and put the spoilers out, but he never put the spoilers back in, flew the last turn to final at a very low altitude, got into the wind from behind, stalled and spun in. Very, very classic situation. So even the very experienced pilots make very basic mistakes. Fortunately, he survived this one, but it looked terrible. Oops, how do I get? So there's more situations where very experienced pilots make really mistakes that sound quite silly. So, for example, a winch cable breaks at 300 feet, and the pilot just freezes, doesn't know what to do, or just freezes, isn't pushing the stick forward, stalls and spins in. Once you spin it at 300 feet, it's game over. So first reaction didn't happen as it should have happened. Pilot slipped the plane into the ground. It was also an experienced pilot. The next one is a truly inexperienced situation, right? Student pilot was taught theoretical spin training, had never been in a spin, got into a spin at altitude, but had no idea how to get out of it, and basically spun the whole plane into the ground from altitude. A pilot with 1,700 hours of experience failed to notice that he opened the air brakes when he extended the engine. In that case, the issue was that he was flying a new glider, had not had recency in that glider. Or a pilot with 1,300 hours of experience climbed too high on tow and drove the tow plane in the ground. So those are very basic piloting mistakes, in some cases by pilots with a lot of hours. So what are those top mistakes? The top mistakes are a delayed or a wrong response to a standard emergency situation. So this is This is on a relative basis the most frequent one, and happens very often to very experienced pilots. And very standard emergency. So on a winch launch, not knowing what to do, not knowing where to land out when the rope breaks, getting on tow behind a tow plane would fall into this situation. So it's all these things that happen, that we train for, and those do not happen very often to students. Students, they're in training, they're very aware of what they're doing, and they're right in practice. So I remember my first, on my second solo winch launch, I had a rope break at 50 feet, and it was a complete non-event because I was just trained to do what I need to do. If it had been on my 100th or 200th or 500th winch launch and nothing had happened before, it might have been a terrible thing because I would not have expected it. But as a student on the second winch launch, I totally expected it because that's what I was trained to expect. So complacency plays into these. Total inexperience definitely does play a role. So there are some accidents that really happen only to people with inexperience. Mishandling of controls because the aircraft is unfamiliar. That is quite often the case, especially when people go to more complex aircraft, especially motor gliders. Or then not paying attention or being unaware of situations. So when do we make those mistakes? Very often when we're just not recently practiced, and so, or when we are inexperienced, when we lack recency, or when we are unfamiliar with a particular aircraft. And then complacency and overconfidence and distractions play a role. So if you take all of these factors, they explain almost all of those basic piloting incidents. If we could, so in order to avoid those accidents, what we need to do is practice the standard emergency situations and be very clear in what to expect or what might happen. And not just, I think it's too, it is not good enough to say, I'm going to turn around at 200 feet. You have to know at every point on a takeoff roll, you have to know at every point, what would you do now? That is what I mean with a standard, knowing what to do in a standard emergency situation, because typically the situation doesn't, in training, we don't do rope break exercises below 200 feet for good reasons. But then that's when they really happen. So regularly practicing them and really thinking about the emergency plan up front is really important. Getting to know your equipment, especially if you fly new aircraft, really important. Don't take any shortcuts, especially if the equipment gets more complicated and complex. Currency matters a great deal. So often people have made very silly, stupid piloting mistakes after taking a longer break, even if they have thousands of hours of experience. Complacency, and against complacency, a little bit of worry helps because it gets your brain working. So each takeoff is dangerous, and if we make ourselves aware of all the things that could happen, that puts us on guard, and we're much less likely to get surprised and then not know what to do. It's this I've read these reports over and over again. People freeze up. Something happens, they don't know what to do. They wait 3, 4, 5 seconds, and they miss all the chance to do something about the situation that they're in. So those are key lessons learned. So the next category, so those two categories cover 70% of accidents. So between those two, right? So all these that we just covered, the basic piloting mistakes, 30% of accidents, and temptations 40%. So 70% of accidents we've already covered. Now we get into a 12% category of pre-flight mistakes and negligence. We had in 2017, we had an incident with our ASK-21, a rigging incident. Nothing happened in that incident as an outcome, as a negative outcome. But during flight, the left aileron partially disconnected, and the stick pressure had to be used to keep the wings level, and at touchdown the aileron completely disconnected. So it was really lucky. We were really lucky that nothing happened in this case in terms of a negative outcome. But it's symptomatic for the type of mistakes that fall into this category of pre-flight negligence. Rigging mistakes are the number one in this category, and in particular older gliders that don't have automatic hookups. I have not seen many with automatic hookups. I don't actually recall if there was any with an automatic hookup. Which shouldn't mean that we shouldn't be doing our pre-flight checks if we have automatic hookups, but they do tend to. There's quite a few of those. Incomplete pre-flight checks play a role. So we have there's this one case where a tow pilot forgot to remove the gust locks prior to launch. Could have easily noticed this with a control check. So if the control checks get missed out, these accidents can happen. Or having an insufficient emergency plan, like on a winch launch, pilot failed to release when the wing touched the ground. On a winch, you really have to release immediately, and the rope is tied to the CG hook, and the acceleration is very fast. And if the wing catches on a winch launch, you're basically if you don't release instantly, you're already in big trouble. So if you don't do this, it's terrible. So if you don't have you don't have that emergency plan really thought out, what do I do if the wing touches the ground? A fraction of a second can be too long to wait. Incomplete takeoff checklist. So this was, I thought this was quite remarkable for an airline pilot. Had 24,000 hours of experience, during which I'm sure he did 24,000 times or 20,000 times did pre-flight checks, the whole checklist. Didn't close the canopy and the air brakes, so obviously did not do the pre-flight checklist when flying the glider. So if you don't do the pre-flight check, it can get you into trouble. The next one is something we have to be careful of, and in Boulder as well, when we fly with water ballast. Please, when you fly with water ballast, tell the tow pilot that you're flying with water ballast and that you need to have the appropriate tow speed. There's also a video from Bruno Vassel where you can see him taking off behind a tow plane that is flying too slow when he's flying ballasted, and he barely kept the plane flying until the tow pilot sped up. So if you don't tell the tow pilot that you're flying with ballast and you need more speed, it might get you into trouble. Or insufficient flight preparation. So in one case, in some cases, there were pilots who were just flying into terrain that they did not know. So they didn't know where they could land. Or there was one case with a pilot who basically looked at the sectional and thought, there's an airport at the sectional, so let's go land there. And there was no airport that he could locate at the location of the sectional. And so then landed on a dirt road that was not suitable for a landing. So the mistakes here in terms of quantity, poor assembly or insufficient control check are the most frequent ones, followed by the incomplete takeoff emergency plan. And again, this takeoff emergency plan, it's really important to be very specific. So what do you do when the tow plane loses power on ground roll? What do you do if the wing touches the ground and you can't get it back up? Or it's particularly important if you have a CG hook and you don't have a nose hook. It gets you're pretty unstable there. Or what happens if you take off and the tow rope breaks at 5 feet or 10 feet or 20 feet? I find it very useful, and I think I published a video on this before, that I made it practice for myself that on every launch, I will say, what will I do now? And I will do that until a new situation emerges. So I will take off and say straight ahead. And straight ahead is valid until I say Elliott's field. And Elliott's field is valid until I say L-shaped field. And L-shaped field is valid until I say left 180 or right 180, depending on where the wind is. And before every takeoff, in my mind, I go through what are those key points. And it's not sufficient in my mind to say, well, I'm going to turn around when I'm at 200 feet, because things happen before you reach 200 feet. And then you don't know what to do because you're at less than 200 feet. So it's really, really important to know before what you do. Be very specific in your takeoff, pre-takeoff planning. Missing things on the checklist was a factor in some cases, and poor cross-country flight preparation was not a huge factor in terms of quantity of cases, but it was a factor in some cases. So when do we make those mistakes? When we allow ourselves to be distracted. This is clearly on those assembly incidents, when we don't put the glider together. When we put the glider together and somebody comes up and chats with us, and we talk, and we take off and forget to hook up the aileron. That'd be terrible. When we allow ourselves to be rushed, same thing. Or when we become complacent. Nothing ever happened. I've assembled this glider 500 times and nothing ever happened, so I'm going to assemble it. I can assemble it in my sleep. So then you basically assemble it. There's something that happened that gets you distracted, and you make a mistake. So do the PCC. If you always do the PCC, you're probably not going to miss any assembly incidents. So how do we avoid them? Take every takeoff seriously, especially if you're experienced, because the more experienced we are, and I notice it myself, I'm getting the glider, I'm like ready to go, and like then I have to remind myself, well, it's a takeoff, and the same things that can happen that I was taught in training that could happen on a training flight, the same things can happen right now. And if I don't take it seriously, then I won't know what to do. So take every takeoff seriously. Finish the checklists. Have a complete emergency plan for each takeoff, covering all the eventualities. When you go cross country, know where you're flying, where can you land. Don't let yourself get rushed or distracted. All right, so then now it's getting even smaller. So these are the things we fear the most, but they don't happen very often. They do happen if we don't pay attention in the air. People will crash. So this was a mid-air accident. I think both pilots got out with the parachute, and I think both survived. But this doesn't always happen. So I've read accidents where one person survived in these crashes and the other one didn't. There's no video, fortunately, in this case. This was just the picture. But examples are failure to maintain visual contact with other aircraft. So, for example, two pilots flying together as a team in the same thermal at 4,000 feet, no other gliders, and they still managed to crash. So two people crash into each other, no other. It's not a huge gaggle, two people. When you fly with only one pilot in a gaggle, this happens quite often as we fly out of Boulder over the mountains. Try and fly so that both pilots can see each other. It makes me much more comfortable if I can see the other and I know the other person can see me, than So I mean, I'm comfortable flying behind someone, but I know they will not be comfortable. And personally, I am not comfortable if somebody is circling in the same thermal at the same altitude as me, and they're just behind me, and I can never see them. If that happens, I'm out of there because I don't like it. And I mean, there's no reason if you have two people, if there's no reason not to fly in a way where you can't see each other. So you actually can thermal much better too. If you are with two people in a thermal, you can see who's climbing better and where they're climbing better. You will get a better climb performance too if you are looking at each other. Failure to observe the landing area. So we had this doesn't, not for us, we don't do winch launches, but still there's a lot of hazards at the Boulder Airfield that we could fail to see. So there was one pilot who didn't see a winch rope, winch cable falling down, and they were landing the glider and landing into the winch rope that was falling down, and that ended fatal. So we have in Boulder, we have a lot of paragliders flying around. We have jumpers. We have people flying erratic patterns. We have students doing rope break exercises and coming back at us. Well, you know, there's lots of things to look out for. So just make sure you look out. Really important. Then no attention to flarm. I mean, maybe attention is maybe the wrong word. Well, people had flarm alarms, but I got an unstable internet connection. Can you hear me? Does it work, Armand?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, you're coming through fine. Keep going.
Okay, because I got another warning message here. So, okay.
Yeah,
so
I've been getting some of those too. And I've got fiber optic. It sounds like you do too. It's just unstable in this. I don't know if it's. And there's a.
Okay, I'll keep going. Do interrupt me if it doesn't work.
I will.
Okay, so then there's a number of incidents where people actually had flarm alarms and collided despite the flarm alarms. We'll get to why that can happen. Or no radio announcements where people were colliding and they were just not talking to one another in the same pattern. So top mistakes are maintaining, visual awareness, or not looking out, not looking for other traffic, failure to communicate, or not paying attention to the warnings that they are getting from the instruments, even if those instruments are fully operational. So when do we make those mistakes? When we allow ourselves to be distracted. Another one, very important, when the workload is high. So those flarm instrument accidents are somebody's really concentrating on centering this very weak and a bit turbulent thermal, and the flarm goes off, but they basically cannot hear the flarm. The pilot had no recollection of the flarm warning, but it was, I'm not sure why they knew that the flarm warning was going off, but it's been a while that I read those, but that just struck me at that incident that there was a flarm warning and they just did not react to it at all. Or when there's some cases where people don't know how to use the safety equipment, or that it's not operational. That's with our flarms, that's a big issue, we know, right? So we have flarm systems, and you have to, we talked about this the other night, you have to make sure that the firmware is updated regularly, otherwise the whole thing doesn't work. It has to be switched on, and you have to know how it works. Otherwise, the best safety equipment won't be very helpful. And obviously, we could be medically impaired. There's some situational awareness things where people just had poor eyesight and couldn't see the other traffic. So how do we avoid these? Eyesight and hearing. Looking outside, keep your look outside. I really like this recommendation. I'm not sure where I read this, but 55 seconds per minute, the eyes should be outside the cockpit. So try and time yourself. I do this occasionally. I'm like, have I really spent the last minute 55 seconds outside the cockpit, or have I looked maybe 15 seconds inside the cockpit? So 5 seconds per minute is probably a good time. It's usually enough to spend time in the cockpit. Keep your eyes outside and look for other traffic. Train yourself to make regular position announcements on the right frequency, especially in high traffic areas. Very often when we fly in Boulder, we fly along the convergence line. We fly between 15,000 and 17,000 feet. And we fly at 110 knots in opposite directions, exactly in the same space. If we don't, in that case, even the flyer might be too slow, it's very hard to see anyone. So I've seen gliders come at me at the same altitude at high speed, and I'm flying at high speed. It's almost impossible to see anyone. So if you know where the other people are with some regular position announcements, where somebody is and where they're headed, you already know where they are and to look out for them. You also pay attention then to your instruments and look for them on the instruments before. So you have more awareness of where they are, so that helps. Equip your glider with appropriate safety technology, learn how to use it and ensure that it works. When you notice something that could happen, that could help somebody improve, you talk about it, speak about it. And pay close attention, not just to things in the air, but also on the ground, especially when you come back to land. Don't just look for gliders in the pattern or in the glider box, but look at what is happening on the ground. Is there somebody milling about an airplane where it looks like they might be pushing it out? So I pay attention to those. I try to pay attention to those situations. I'm like, I don't know if they're going to push this out. I'm trying to contact them on the radio so that they won't be doing it. So it's those things where you really have to pay attention, not just what happens in the air, but also what's happening on the ground, especially when you come back and land. Okay, so we've covered those accidents, those 90% that are avoidable. And then there are some situations when accidents are not avoidable. And so this is another accident in Nephi. So this is Dave Nadler's Arcus M, and he talked about this at length. He gave a presentation at the convention, at the SSA convention in Little Rock about this as well. So in that case, the cause of that accident was never clear. He basically, the glider entered a spiral dive at 17,000 feet, and he could not control. The rudder was stuck to the side, and the aileron was uncontrollable, and the glider was not controllable. And a root cause of that accident was never found out, and both he and his co-pilot were able to bail out and survived. Dave actually got injured during the landing with the parachute on the side of the hill. And as I said, no accident cause could be detected, but I'm absolutely, I'm confident that there was no pilot mistake that I could discern that happened in this case. So what are some of those accidents were unavoidable as I read those accident reports, and here are some of the mistakes. There are some accidents with third-party mistakes. So you could say, well, that's a human mistake and it shouldn't happen. That's true. But if you're the pilot, you will not detect it. So that's why I call it unavoidable from the pilot's perspective. So for example, in this one case where somebody hooked up a glider in a way that the cable couldn't be released. And then there was a mechanical failure on the winch cutter where the winch cutter failed as well. And the pilot, the glider was just attached to the winch cable during the winch launch and couldn't separate themselves from the winch cable. It's not a pleasant situation. This case in Germany where a glider was hit from behind by a military aircraft traveling at 400 knots. There's nothing you can do about that. I mean, if that happens, it happens. Heart attacks, you could say, well, maybe the pilot could have known that they shouldn't be flying. Possibly, I don't know. I've classified those as unavoidable. And very rare, there are some cases of equipment failure, exceedingly rare. So I wouldn't worry too much about those, but there was one case where a wing of a duodiscus broke in mid-flight at a normal operating speed, and that led then to a recall, so an AD, and those issues have been fixed on those aircraft. But there are exceedingly rare, these things can happen as well. So there's some of those. So the good news in all of this is that 90% of accidents are avoidable. But the bad news is that we really have to work on it. It's not that by hoping that things will never happen to us, they will never happen to us. All of these things that I talked about, all of these things can happen to any of us. And unless we really remember to worry about these things, they're more likely to happen than if we think, well, they won't happen, because they do happen. So fateful decisions, eroded margins are the biggest culprit. And this chart basically summarizes the things that we've talked about and the things you can do to avoid those mistakes, or to avoid those situations. This is really avoiding situations where where you have to take actions and make decisions before you get into a situation where you can't do anything about it. So, for example, come back to land, be high enough to come back to land. You will not be tempted then to, or you will not fall into the trap of thermaling at a low altitude at a point where you can no longer fly coordinated and at the proper airspeed. Basic piloting mistakes, how do you avoid those? Practice those standard emergency situations, know your equipment, get a check right after a break, keep your alertness, worry at least a bit on every flight. I say stay humble and seek critique. If I say seek critique, what I mean with that is that we tend to not want to criticize other people. And we all like to think that we're good pilots and everybody else is too. But I think we all should ask other people for honest critique and really say, what did please tell me. So I ask of all of you, if you see me do something wrong, or please tell me so I won't do it again. If you don't tell me, I might just not think there is anything to it, and I might just keep doing it. And so please tell me, and please tell each other. We can help each other stay safe. On pre-flight negligence, never skip a PCC takeoff checklist. I mean, that's pretty obvious. And have a specific and complete emergency plan for each takeoff. That is something we don't do often enough, and I think that's something this habit can really help. And then on situational awareness, it's pretty obvious how we can avoid those. So what all of this analysis taught me is that our sport is pretty dangerous. That experience doesn't protect us, but that 90% of accidents are avoidable, and that we must learn from the mistakes that others have made, because we may not have a chance to learn from our own mistakes. It also taught me that most accidents, most mistakes have been invented, and if we study them carefully and repeatedly, we're less likely to repeat them. As a club, I think what we learn best from stories stories of mistakes that our friends have made. And so I think it's really important that we talk about them. And we tend to not want to talk about them. So we tend to want to make them taboo. And that's not a good thing. So even if nothing happened, and somebody does something that's dangerous, or we do something that's dangerous, it's good to talk about it. So if we can establish an atmosphere where we trust each other, then and talk freely about it, and not punitive. So punitive culture is terrible. If somebody makes a mistake and they get punished for the mistake, nobody will ever talk about any mistake. So don't cast blame when somebody makes a mistake. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes. I bet everyone makes mistakes. And when this happens, we should focus on what went wrong and not who did something wrong. It's very often we like to, when people talk about mistakes that other people made, they talk about the mistakes that those people made. And they don't talk about with them that made those mistakes. They talk amongst themselves at the exclusion of that person. Too often that happens. So that doesn't help anybody. What really helps if we have an honest dialogue, and if somebody does something that's dangerous, talk to them if they're even aware that something dangerous has happened, and focus on the what, on what can be done differently, and what so that the dangerous situation doesn't happen. So focus on the what and not on the who. And so please share your mistakes with others. It takes a lot of courage, but you have a chance to save someone else's life if they don't make the same mistake. Remember, 11% of the cases, you don't get a second chance. So we have to learn from the mistakes that others have made, because we might not be able to learn from our own. Okay, so I want to close off on 3 key habits that will help us stay alive, and these will cover not 90%, but they will cover like 60-70% of the cases. If we only do those things, 70% of the accidents will already be avoided. Take off seriously. So practice your standard emergencies and have a very specific plan in mind before each takeoff, what it is, what you will do in case X happens. And X can be tow plane loses power, tow rope breaks, somebody runs into the runway, the rope breaks at 10 feet, at 50 feet. Where do you go? Have a specific plan for every takeoff. Never delay to land. Remember, most of those accidents that were accidents due to temptations were landing accidents that happened because somebody was circling low to the ground. So if you don't delay the landing, it's a huge amount of risk is already out of the way. So my rule in Boulder is to arrive no lower than 1500 AGL. And because we have a very busy airport, there's a lot of other air traffic. There could be jumpers around. There could be the runway could be blocked. There could be 3 other gliders that are landing at the same time. 1500 could even be on the low side. So I try to be higher if possible, but 1500 is really the lowest that I want to come back to Boulder. So that gives me time to sort out the landing order, make really sure that the runway will be clear by the time I need to land. So I'm not tempted to circle at 400 feet and still waiting for the runway to clear. And examine your priorities each time you're tempted. So think of this temptation. The temptation is that can really get you. So remember, when you fly, when we say safety is always our #1 priority. Whenever you've really pushed, you're eager to complete something, you try to get over that ridge, or you try to make it back through bad weather, that's the time when you really have to step back and say, what is my priority? Is my priority to get back to the home airport, or is my priority to fly another day? And I think the priority should be to be safe and fly another day, and then you're prepared and you've thought through, what will I do when, and then you will actually be much more likely to do it than wait until it's too late to do something. So think about what could possibly go wrong, what's my plan B, what's my plan C, and that will allow you to stay safe. Okay, so there's a lot of resources here that you will, I will send this presentation will get attached to the material will get attached to the video on YouTube. And you can, each of those things are hypertext links, so you can look those up. I think all of those articles that I'm citing here on the left side are really good articles that are very worth the while of reading. And then the one that I highlighted here, Soaring Risks and Risk Mitigation, that's something where this is kind of a site on my own blog where I sort of provide all these links and more information about risks and risk mitigation and things that I wrote about it. And then there's accident report databases, links to those accident report databases that you find on this site as well. So I'm sorry that I'm closing on a sort of a downer here, but I think it is important. I would feel terrible if I wouldn't share this with you. So I want to make sure I share it, and the next time we'll talk about our ground school. I'm sure we have more uplifting topics again. But with that, I'm gonna wish you all a safe soaring season and a fun-filled soaring season. And I think we can all be safe. This sport does not have to be as dangerous as it is, but we have to work on it. And I think that's really the key message is we have to work on it every time we go fly. We have to think about it, that this is not we have to do something to stay safe, but we can. 90% of accidents are avoidable. So thank you. All right, so Armand, I don't know, I'll leave it to you if you want to do questions or discussion, or if somebody wants to share experience.
If you would take the share screen off, let's see if we can get everybody into view here and talk about this a little bit. So Clemens, thanks for doing this and putting together and making it something where there's a lot of analysis of the data rather than giving us a blow by blow, an accident by accident, incident by incident report. That was real good. Maybe we do get together at a club in a more confidential setting and talk about the mistakes that we made. Because when you brought that up, I thought about a few I could share, and I know one I have shared with a few people. But yeah, there's plenty of mistakes that we can make. We got to make a lot of decisions in soaring, and soaring's very different than power flying in that we're making a lot of decisions. And when you're making a lot of decisions, the odds that you're going to make 100% of the correct decisions aren't really very good. And so we all need to say that. Does anybody have something to add, to discuss?
Richard Hall has his hand up.
I'm sorry, who has his hand up?
Richard Hall.
Oh, Richard. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hey, guys. One of the things, I thought this was an excellent presentation, Clemens, but as you embark on your contest career and we talk about the concept of risk, I think it's really important for people to understand the difference between what has been referred to as sporting risk versus a safety or operational risk. Because when you say don't fly off into the unknown, well, by definition, on most contest tasks, that's exactly what you're going to be doing. You're going to be doing things that are unknown, and it becomes imperative that you never forget the underlying safety principles that you have, because you could say, hey, I'm doing this, I'm taking risk. There has to be a hard stop there somewhere where it's like, okay, time to stay safe.
Yeah, I wrote about this too. There's an article that I wrote about specifically the sporting risk and the safety risks and how to differentiate between the two, and also how to, I asked myself before I would even fly a contest, I asked myself if you can be successful in a contest without taking safety risks. And my analysis showed you absolutely can. In fact, the people who are flying safer are the ones who tend to do better. And I did this by using a tool where there's no safety risk involved, and that is Condor. So I looked at Condor results and found that the people who win the most races have the least amount of crashes, and which is interesting, because you would think that the people in Condor there is right, nothing happens if you crash, but the people who win, are the people who never crash. So they don't, by definition, they can't be flying that. They should just know what to do. But to your point about not flying into the unknown, I mean, what I mean with that is not flying over a terrain where you don't know where to land, because that's a safety factor. And I would not do that. I'm not going to do this in any contest. I just spend a lot of time studying contest areas so that I know where I can land. But I'm not going to fly in an area where I don't know where to land.
Anyone else?
Joe?
My comment, I have two comments. One, you talk about risk that's out of your control. The reason we have a Picket Heats trophy every year at our dinner is that because we had a lady who took off in an aircraft and went up and was thermaling. I was there that day, and lawn darted into the road over by where the lake and the trailers are on the North Airport Road. It was later determined that the failure wasn't her piloting skills. It was a mechanical failure where the old aircraft, I think it was an ASW-15 or something of that nature, where you stuck the horizontal end and pinned it. And there was a mechanical defect and the horizontal came off. So the glider effectively turned into a lawn dart. So that can happen, and it happens closely. And we memorialized that loss with the Picket Heats thing. The other thing that comes to mind immediately, and you bring it up, is you might delay your decision and try to stretch it to get home. I affectionately think of that of the ASK-21, because a big boogeyman there's no trailer to come get you that's entirely obvious. And I could see where that could be in the back of your head if for some reason you're out and you're just in one of those situations, you're going to try to extend to get it back home and you can't. But I could see where you're going to extend it because you don't, there's no trailer to drag you back. So,
Yeah. So I would just say, if that happens, please land.
yeah,
We'll figure out how to get it back.
We've got
Yeah,
lots
I
of
would
ways to get it
I would
back,
also
but
add on the policy on the K-21 is do not fly it out of range. The K-21 is not to
Sure,
be used.
but if it happens and you have to land.
don't land out, right?
Well,
John?
There's a perfectly beautiful ASK-21 trailer about 200 yards east of the Boulder Shack, and it just happens to be owned by the Air Command. And there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't use that to retrieve our ASK-21 if we knew the people that were in charge.
That's the point I'm trying to make, is to say, don't worry about it.
Even if we have to rent a flatbed truck and get you on back piece by piece, do not think of landing that thing off field as a big
Don't
deal.
let that be a reason why you try to make it back in the unforeseen thing that you think you're within glide, and oh, guess what? You're just not.
Right, exactly. Yeah, please land if you have to land.
Yeah, and we'll get you.
but also the policy is don't fly out of range.
Sure. Don't fly out of range, but if you're out of range and you realize you're out of range, you're out of range.
There's also a policy against crashing too, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's a policy against crashing. The policy against crashing is way bigger.
Keep it close to the airport. Anyone else? Do we have any of our guests who are from Black Forest or elsewhere that have anything to say? I saw Nick Kennedy joined us. I know he was flying at Nephi. when one of the crashes that you opened with was there. Nick, are you still with us? Anyone else?
Well, we
Well,
had
there's-
another one where 3 RVs were flying over from Longmont and the exhibition there, the fly-in, and for some reason they decided to cross midfield, and one of them took 13 inches off the wing of a Grove 103. I think Al was flying with a student at the time, and they were able to do a quick pattern land with 13 inches off the wing, and that was just right over the airport. So it can, you just have to be aware.
Well, all right, on that,
There's someone, Mark Arnold.
Yeah, just a quick comment. I just want to thank Clemens and the club. It's been a fantastic ground school series, and I think you guys are doing really a terrific job. I'm learning a lot, and I really appreciate it. Very, very small item I'll just mention on the safety topic, which is that I have a very rigorous habit of always looking at the approach end of the runway. I always look down the runway to make sure that crossing traffic, I operate out of Longmont, and I'm also cognizant of parachutists coming down. But I had an incident, not an incident, but an occasion not long ago where there was an unannounced aircraft making a landing opposite direction. And I learned from that incident or that occasion that I was not adequately scanning the opposite direction approach path. And ever since then, I've made a very strong habit of including that in my situational awareness. After 47 years of flying, that had just never occurred to me that I needed to be alert for someone landing the wrong way, and came as a bit of a surprise to me. Fortunately, no one was injured, but there were 3 gliders on final, and he was actually doing an instrument check ride coming the other way, but he was on the wrong frequency. So just a heads up to always include the other approach end of the runway for short final.
yeah, and in Boulder, flying in both directions is very common, especially at the end of the day when the cross-country gliders are coming back at 3, 4, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Most of them are parked at the west end of the field, so we'll land on 2-6 and carrying a lot of energy to get to the far end of the runway. And we need to be making a lot of calls when we do that. We shouldn't just be making one call when we are 2 miles south and we're going to land. We probably need to be alert to call downwind, even if it makes for a busy radio, but at that time of day it's not that busy, but we need to really be announcing ourselves that we're landing 2-6. And sometimes we'll even do it, downwind for convenience to get to the west end of the field. So we need to be chatting it up that we're where we are. Other comments? I don't know if we would ever want to huddle, in confidence and talk about the mistakes that we've made. But that's something that maybe we can think about as a club. And if we want to do that, of course, no recording, but no, as Clemens says, no hammering on each other or
There serious needs to be a time limit on that too, because that could be hours.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and maybe it needs to be a limited number from each time. But yeah, the more we fly, the more mistakes we make. And anyway.
Yeah, we do tend to learn most from each other.
So with that, let's, if nobody else has anything, we'll go ahead and conclude. If somebody does have something, sing out. But the chat sessions here, there's a lot of thank yous to Clemens. This was another excellent presentation that I think will probably get a lot of review on the YouTube channel. We did have more than 50 participants. That's great. This is, safety is something that applies to everybody, whether you're just started lessons, or you've been flying for a long time, or you go cross country or not. This is one really for everybody, and I'm glad we had a great turnout for it. We were a little worried that the turnout might not be so good because it's kind of a dark subject. But I think Clemens did a great job at not making it dark, of shining a light on what we need to be doing, and where the difficulties come from, rather than making it as gory as it could have been. So thanks so much, Clemens. Great job. And good night, everyone. And I think we're just about to start soaring season. So let's fly safe and fly often. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.